So let's move on to introduce Keiron Derek Brown from the Earthworm Society. Delighted to have you with us here this evening. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us. I will hand over to you, Keiron.
Thank you, Sophie. I might start with a few little caveats. First of all, I apologise, Sophie, because most earthworms don't have common names. So people might ask questions in Latin. I warned Sophie beforehand that I'm not a Latin speaker or an ancient Greek speaker for that matter either. So I tend to pronounce scientific names fast and confidently and assume that what I said is right. Secondly, with the polls, just to let you all know, they are anonymous. They're not designed to test you. You won't be getting a certificate at the end of the talk. So please do have a guess. It's just a bit of fun. Right, okay, right, let's get started then. So exploring earthworm ecology. So I'm going to start by going straight into, here we go, first technical difficulty, a little bit of annelid taxonomy. So straight in heavy, but don't worry, the next slide will explain it all a bit more. So earthworms, I thought it's good to start with what are earthworms in terms of the living kingdoms. So earthworms belong to the phylum Annelida. So annelids are the segmented worms, and they're all classed as eukaryotes, which means that they have cells with a nucleus enclosed within a nuclear envelope, and they're all animals. So in the kingdom Animalia, which means they're multicellular, unable to produce their own nutrients like plants. They can move their bodies, so they're mobile, and they have a embryonic stage called blastulation. And I won't be taking any questions on that because I probably don't know any more than I've just said. But annelids are also, so a non-taxonomic term, annelids are also invertebrates. So they're animals without a backbone. And they're defined as having a body cavity, movable bristles known as setae, which we'll come to a bit later, and a body divided in segments by transverse rings. So they're segmented worms. A lot of annelid taxonomy is relatively poorly understood. So what I'm about to show you comes with all sorts of caveats, and it will probably change within a couple of weeks, let alone years. So I thought I'd introduce you to where earthworms are within the segmented worms and what their relatives are. So the first division we've got here is the clitellata and the polychaete worms. So polychaete worms are related to earthworms. These are more commonly known as bristle worms. The polychaete worms that you may be familiar with are the bobbit worm, which is this strange creature that you sometimes get in the bottom of fish tanks that eats all the fish. So if you've got a fish tank and your fish just keep disappearing, look in the storage, you might have a big bobbit worm there. More likely, though, a more likely species that you'll know are the lugworms, which you get on the beach. The clitellata, though, is where we'll find the earthworms, and that divides into the leeches and what we call the oligochaetes. So we're probably all familiar with what leeches are. They're mainly freshwater, but you do get them in marine and terrestrial environments. They're all either predators or parasites feeding on the blood of host organisms. So within the oligochaetes, this is where it gets even more complicated. We've got a number of different groups. Now, the first set of groups here, I've put them here on the diagram, but the taxonomy is all over the place, so they may end up somewhere else. And these are just a bunch of different families of oligochaetes that some of which you may be familiar with. The enchetrades are potworms, so they're little white or yellow worms that look very earthworm-like, but a bit smaller. And there's also a load of other aquatic oligochaetes, including the sludgeworms and blackworms, which I've never seen myself, so I don't expect any of you guys to know about them. We've also got the Moniligastrida, which are another type of earthworm, but not the type we'll be talking about today. Some more aquatic worms, and the crass clitellata, which is what we're going to be talking about today, the true earthworms. Now, around the globe, we've got more than 20 families of earthworms, with just 3 families within the British Isles, and most of the species are within the Lumbricidae family, and we've got one species in those other two families, which I won't even try and pronounce, which are probably introductions from other parts of the world. So that's a bit about what annelids are, what earthworms are scientifically, but I actually find it much more useful to look at the word, because I think that gives us a clearer and more simpler explanation of what earthworms are. So if we divide up the word, earth can have several meanings, but the one that we're interested in is the substance of the land surface, the soil, because this is where you'll find earthworms. And the term worm, again, it can be a derogatory way of speaking about a person, but it can also mean any number of creeping or burrowing invertebrate animals with long, slender, soft bodies and no limbs. So we've all heard of glowworms, we've heard of potentially wireworms, things like that. So there are other things within the animal kingdom that are called worms. But if we put those two words together, we get the dictionary definition of an earthworm, which is a burrowing annelid worm that lives in the soil, and it's important for aerating and draining the soil and in burying organic matter. So that is an earthworm. So I'm going to start now with our first question, and we've got a picture here of an earthworm, and I'm just going to launch this poll. There we go. So that should have appeared. If you can start popping your vote, true or false, this earthworm is an adult. Don't worry if you're not sure, hazard a guess, and it'll be interesting to see what people come back with. I'll let you know this is just maybe 3 centimeters long. It's very small. That's changing what people are saying. But yeah, so I'm interested to see. I'll just give you another couple of seconds to vote on that. I've had most of your vote. Right, okay, so let's see what you said. So there wasn't much in it. 61% of you have said that it's true, this is an adult, and 39% of you have said that it's false. Actually, the majority are right, it is an adult. And the reason we can tell, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here we've got a feature called the saddle or the clitellum. And that feature tells us it's an adult. So young earthworms, juvenile earthworms don't have that feature. It's part of the reproductive system of the earthworm. So moving on. So in terms of what is an earthworm morphologically, so earthworms don't have a lot of visible external features. They're quite simple looking. And we're lucky in the UK for identifying earthworms. We can do it based on external morphological characters, but you do need a microscope, which means you often need to, you usually need to collect, kill and preserve the earthworms so that you can look at them under a microscope. So we won't be covering that today, but the features that you can see on the outside of an earthworm are the prostomium, which is basically an earthworm name for a head. You've got a feature called the male paw. You've got the clitellum or saddle, and on there you've got a feature which is unique to different species of earthworm called the tubercular pubitatis, and this is what they use to grip onto each other during mating. And then you've got these little dots running in lines along the earthworm. These are the setae. So these are little hairs, bristles that they use for movement. And if you remember when we were talking about annelids and what defines an annelid, I mentioned setae. So important thing to also point out is that earthworms have a head and they have a tail, and they are symmetrical if you chop them down the middle, but they do have a top and a bottom. So if you chop them sideways, they wouldn't be symmetrical. So that's an earthworm from the outside. Right, so we've got another question now. I'm going to keep them coming thick and fast. Bear with me because I'm just going to have to shuffle this around a little. Right, okay, so the second question, is this earthworm male or female? So I'll give you another 10 or so seconds to answer that. If you're not sure, have a guess. And your options are male, female, both, or neither. Okay, right, I might end that now. Share the results. So we've got, wow, 69% of you went for both. Few for male, few for female, few for neither. Well, the majority again are right. Pleased to hear. People know they're earthworms. Yeah, earthworms are what we call simultaneous hermaphrodites, which means that they have both male and female parts. And when they mate, they act as both the male and female. So when they're getting jiggy with it, everybody gets to be the male and the female. So everybody will pass over their sperm and everybody will get pregnant in an ideal world. Right, okay, so let me just get rid of that. So that brings us on to the life cycle of an earthworm. So as with all animals, earthworms will start their life as an egg. And eggs of earthworms are contained in an egg sac that we call a cocoon. So earthworm cocoons can hold between 1 and 20 fertilized eggs, though British species tend to be just a single fertilized egg. The earthworms can produce between 3 and 80 cocoons per year, depending on the species. So I get asked a lot of questions about things like how long do earthworm live, how many cocoons they produce. Thing we need to remember is that these are a whole, they're groups of families. So it's almost like ordering, like asking how long does a mammal live? There's a lot of variation. Deeper living species tend to produce fewer cocoons as their cocoons are better protected because they're buried deep underground, whereas surface dwelling species of earthworm tend to produce many more cocoons because they're much more likely to be predated or exposed to the elements. And generally, young worms will hatch in 3 weeks to 5 months. So again, there's a lot of variation. It will depend on the species, but it will also depend on things like the environmental conditions. Earthworms can wait out unfavorable conditions within the cocoon. Just like plants can wait out similar unfavorable conditions as a seed in the soil as well. So our cocoons have hatched and we've got young baby earthworms. So hatchling earthworms look just like adult earthworms, but they're much smaller. The earthworms are born with the right number of segments, and what they'll tend to do is get bigger and bigger as they feed and grow, and they grow into juvenile earthworms, which will be the same color as the adults, and they'll look, for all intents and purposes, the same. They just won't have the sexual reproduction features. So they don't have the saddle or the tubercular pubitatis, that TP feature, which means that we can't identify juveniles in general. As they mature sexually, and become an adult, they gain these features. And then they will, in general, earthworms will reproduce with another earthworm, and I'll come back to that in a second. But when they reproduce, what they essentially do is 69. So you can see here, we've got 2 examples of earthworms mating. They'll line up alongside each other. And then I'll try and explain this. It's not the easiest thing to explain. But what each earthworm will do is it will release sperm that will run down the side of the other earthworm and be stored in a feature called the spermathecal pores. And it's stored there. The earthworms, after they've exchanged sperm, will separate. And then what will happen is the saddle will move down the earthworm. It will pick up the own earthworm's eggs. Then it will pick up the stored sperm from the spermatheca, and it will come off, and it will essentially pinch. Sorry, I'm on the wrong one there. The sides will pinch, and it will become a lemon-shaped cocoon. So in reality, it's not actually the clitellum that comes off. It produces a mucus sheath that comes down the earthworm. But often, after earthworms have just mated, they may appear to have no clitellum. So it's quite hard to explain. If you want a simplified version of it, there's a really weird but great photo on the internet, video on the internet with Isabella Rossellini dressed up as an earthworm and demonstrating it. So highly recommend that. So, and then that brings us back to the cycle where we've got the fertilized egg in the cocoon and so on. So just move on to a very brief bit of earthworm anatomy. I'm just going to give you some highlights here. Within the head end of the earthworm, you've got a muscular area that includes the brain. So earthworms have a pin-sized brain. Charles Darwin demonstrated that earthworms can show some intelligence through early behavioral studies. Like birds, who also don't have teeth, earthworms have a crop and a gizzard because they need something to help them break down the food that they eat. I mean, they're eating things like leaf litter and soil, which are actually quite hard to break down. So the crop and the gizzard helps them do that. They also have a circulatory system. So earthworms have what we call pseudo hearts, which are these thickened blood vessels that help pump the body. They come in pairs, and British earthworms tend to have 5 pairs of those. Unlike most invertebrates, they also have hemoglobin-based blood. So like people, if you cut an earthworm, they'll bleed red. But a large proportion of the body is dedicated to the intestine, to the digestive system. And I'll take you quickly along there. So starting, just like us, they have a mouth. So they have the buccal cavity, where which is the entrance to their gut, and where at the head end where the food enters the digestive system. Then from there it goes through a thick muscular and glandular section called the pharynx, in through the esophagus, and finally and then onto the crop and gizzard, where it gets broken down. The majority of the digestive system is the intestine, and then just like us and most animals, it all ends with an anus. So earthworms do poo, and food is basically constantly moving through this system. So we talked about earthworms being made up of lots of transverse segments. So what happens if we cut an earthworm through one of those segments? What will we see? So they have a outer ring called the cuticle, which helps protect the earthworms from the elements. And then under there, you've got 2 sets of muscles, the circular muscles and the longitudinal muscles. And those muscles help the earthworms contract and extend, so they're used for earthworms movement and burrowing. And then within there, you've got the body cavity, which houses everything else. So within there, you've got the intestines running through. You've got the blood vessels, and earthworms have 3 main blood vessels that run the length of the body, 1 on top and 2 on the bottom. And they're connected with blood vessels that go around each segment as well. You've got a nerve cord, which connects the brain to the nerves in each segment. And you've got excretory organs, so nephridia. And the nephridia are used to excrete, so it's the way that they get rid of urine in the same way that we pee. But they're also able to excrete other things like mucus, which helps keep the body moist, which is important for earthworms. But it can also be used as a deterrent for predators, and it can be used to line their earthworm burrows as well. So lots of uses for that. And then finally, on each segment, you'll have these 4 in British earthworms at least, you'll have these 4 pairs of setae as well. We're not going to cover this really much in this talk, but how those pairs of setae are spaced out is really important for identifying the earthworms as well. So there is variation in that. So the setae are used help with locomotion as well. So I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but what you basically need to know is the way the earthworms move are by contracting the various muscles that they've got. So we've got those circular muscles, those longitudinal muscles, and then they also have muscles that contract and extend the setae. So there's a specific order in which those muscles are contracted in order for the earthworm to move forward. They can also reverse that process to move backwards as well. So earthworms can move in either direction. So just because you see one end of an earthworm coming out of a burrow, that doesn't mean it's necessarily the head end. The head end tends to be pointier and is usually closer to the saddle. The only way it would be further from the saddle is if the earthworm's been damaged or chopped. And like, yeah, the whole process will repeat. Pardon me? Okay, another question for you so I can catch my breath. All right. So the next question here is, earthworms will drown in waterlogged soils due to flooding. Is that true or false? While you're thinking about that, I'll just rehydrate a little. So we've got most of you have voted. It's anonymous. I don't know who's saying what. Give you a couple more seconds, 3 more seconds. So get your votes in if you haven't already. Let's see what you said. So with this one, I've got 74% have said true and 26% have said false. Actually, the 26% are correct in this case. Annelids are traditionally water inhabiting organisms. So earthworms are a little bit different in that you find them on land, but earthworms can actually breathe through their skin. They don't have lungs. They breathe through the cuticle. So they need their skin to remain moist at all times. So they won't drown in waterlogged soils because they can handle living in wet soils. In fact, some of them you only find in waterlogged soils, and they are fine if you drop them in water. They won't drown. However, that doesn't mean that waterlogged soils can't kill earthworms, because what can happen if we've got flooding, if the water doesn't drain very fast and it's left stagnant for a long time, the earthworms can take all of the oxygen out of the water, so that it's deoxygenated, so they can actually suffocate. So it's a little bit of a trick question. Can earthworms die due to flooding? Yes, because they can end up using all the oxygen and suffocate, but they won't technically drown. So a question that I get asked quite a lot is whenever there's floods, people will ask, will this destroy the earthworm populations? The truth is earthworms as a group of species are quite well adapted to living in those kind of environments. So even if some species do die out because of the water being deoxygenated in the soil, you've still got that next generation of earthworms on the way in the form of the cocoons, and those cocoons won't hatch unless the conditions are right, so they can wait it out that way as well. So a couple of little other, I'll stop sharing that. A couple of other little interesting bits about earthworm biology. Earthworms do have an ability to regenerate lost segments. So it's a really great, fantastic, amazing ability that they've got, but it is variable by species, and some species are much more able to regenerate lost segments than others. They tend to generate the same number of segments that were lost, so you shouldn't really find earthworms that are longer than they originally were in terms of the number of segments. Another question that I get asked a lot is, if you chop an earthworm in half, will you get 2 earthworms? In theory, you could, because they can theoretically regenerate segments at both ends. But the reality is that they tend to be more likely to survive a chop if the break is between the saddle and the tail. So we looked at the anatomy earlier. Most of the important organs are between the saddle and the head. So actually, usually the tail end will die, and the further along the chop is, so further towards the tail, the more likely it is that the head end will survive. When they grow the tail back, they tend to grow all the segments back in this thin little tail, like you can see in the picture here. And then the tail will quite often be not very pigmented as well. And then it will gradually get the pigment and get bigger until it's the same size as the original tail. Earthworms will also display a behavior called autotomy, which is the casting off of a part of the body, e.g. the tail, by an animal under threat. So it's the same behavior that you get with lizards, like slow worms. When they feel threatened, they'll drop part of their tail so that the predator is busy with that while they try and escape. I don't think it's consistently done by all species, but it has been seen in some British species, so it definitely does occur there. Another interesting behaviour, so I don't know if any of you will have ever found earthworms like this when you've been digging up your garden. So you will sometimes find earthworms knotted up in a ball like this. When they're doing this, it's because they went into a state of torpor, so a state that we call diapause. So diapause is a period of suspended development and growth with decreased metabolism. So in winter, we call that hibernation. That's when they'll go into diapause due to winter conditions such as frosts and cold temperatures. Earthworms will also do it when it's summer conditions as well. So if it's really, really hot and really dry, we talked earlier about how earthworms need that moisture layer to breathe. That can be quite dangerous for them. So they'll go into aestivation. Before they go into aestivation, so as a first step to avoid conditions, quite often earthworms will go deeper into the soil as well. And quite often they'll go deeper, and then if things don't get better for them, they'll go into aestivation and wait it out. Right, so I think that's enough about general earthworm biology. We'll now look at the importance of earthworms and their ecology. So if we start by going way back to 322, well, between 322 and 384 BC, Aristotle is rumoured to have said that earthworms are the intestines of the earth. So for a long time, we've known that earthworms are important. But it wasn't until this fella came along, Charles Darwin, that we really got any information about why and how important earthworms are. So Charles Darwin wrote a book about earthworms. It was the last book he ever wrote. It was called The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. And it was published in 1881. It was his last book before he died. And during his lifetime, it was his best-selling book. So it did way better than that other book he wrote that people know a lot more about. Within that book, Charles Darwin said this phrase: "Worms have played a more important part in the history of the world than most persons would at first suppose." So Charles Darwin got it, and if he was alive today, I'm sure he'd be the current president of the Earthworm Society of Britain. Despite Charles Darwin studying earthworms in depth and writing a whole book about them, though, they kind of didn't really get studied all that much afterwards for quite some time. And even if we look back at Gilbert White, he rarely mentioned them. They were just mentioned in one of his communications. They weren't mentioned in his most famous publication. And he again recognized their importance. He was a little bit less kind in how he worded it. He said earthworms are in appearance a small and despicable link in the chain of nature, yet if lost would make a lamentable chasm. So he recognized their importance. I wouldn't personally class them as despicable, though. So if Gilbert White was alive today, I'd have a debate with him with the use of that term. So in more recent years, as of 2009, the Earthworm Society of Britain was set up, and that was set up to study earthworms. So my role with the society is a recording officer. So I run the National Earthworm Recording Scheme. So I support people that go out and identify and submit records of earthworms, and that's what my main focus is in my spare time. We'll come back to that a little bit more later. So another poll for you here. Sorry, just bear with me 1 sec. There we go. Oh, no, ignore that. I forgot to give this poll. So what we'll do is we'll just drop this in the chat if that's okay, Sophie. How many species of earthworm do we have in the UK? So in the British Isles, sorry, not the UK. So if people want to have a guess in the chat, and I'll give you a couple of seconds to drop things in there, and I'll have a look. So we've got 3, we've got 50, 18, 79, 28, 30. And the person who gets the closest will get a special mention. All right, let's have a look. So after 30, what have we got? 250, 29, 250, 8, 26, 24. Right, okay, so we've got a winner. One person was 1 out. So Christopher Fry, well done. With your 30, you were just 1 out. We've got 31 in the UK. So yeah, but lots of guesses there, and that kind of tells me what I already know, that a lot of people don't know a lot about how many species we've got in the UK, and people are never sure whether earthworms are this hugely varied group or they're quite a small group. But for an invertebrate group, there's actually relatively few species. We're not going to go into species today, but I do want to tell you a little bit more about the different types of earthworms. So what we're going to do is talk about how you can divide them up by their ecological group. So we've got anesic earthworms, epigeic earthworms, and endogeic earthworms, and I'm going to introduce a 4th group called compost earthworms. And I'm going to explain how you tell the difference between those groups based on colour and size. But the groupings are interesting because they're different ecological categories. So they live in different parts of the soil. So you can see here we've got the epigeic on the surface, the endogeic in these horizontal burrows, and the anesic that come up to the surface and go deep down as well. And the impact that earthworms have on the ecology of the soil is really a mixture of all those groups together. So in the UK, we describe our earthworm fauna as belonging to 4 ecological categories. So the first of these is the anesic earthworms, and these are the deep burrowing earthworms. So these live in deep vertical burrows. They surface at night to feed and mate. They'll feed on leaves on the surface and they'll pull them into their burrows, but they'll also feed on soil, including really deep soil that's very nutrient poor. So in their intestines, they're mixing up nutrient-rich leaves and decaying plant material with nutrient-poor deep soil where all the nutrients have pretty much been used up. For telling the different categories of earthworm apart, we use colour and size. And the way I like to explain it is, if you think of their colour as an analogy of like a suntan. So the more exposure that these earthworms have with the outer environment, the deeper their colour tends to be. And I'm not saying that's a result of exposure to the elements, but it just helps you remember their behaviours. So anesic earthworms will quite often keep their tail anchored in their burrow. The tails are quite pale. As you get towards the head, they get darker and darker, and they've often got very dark, deep red or purple heads. They're large in size as well. These are our biggest earthworms. So all British anesic species can reach lengths of over 15 centimetres. The largest species, the lobworm or the common earthworm, Lumbricus terrestris. So if you did any experiments on earthworms at school, it would have been on Lumbricus terrestris. They can grow up to 35 centimetres. So these are actually fairly big invertebrates. How deep do they go? Well, most anesic species will burrow to a depth of around 45 centimetres. So they can go fairly deep down. The lobworm, that bigger species, will commonly burrow to around 1 metre, but it has been reported as deep as 2.5 metres. The graph I've got up in front of you here just shows one study that looked at earthworms over 1 year and records where they found them in the soil. So this isn't necessarily their burrow depth, this is the depth they were found at. So you can see it varies as well, and they might be nearer the surface at certain times of year. For example, if we look here, this matches the warmer months there, for some reason, they tend to be nearer the surface here. So that's burrowing depth. Lumbricus terrestris also makes these features we call earthworm middens. So earthworm middens are a combination of earthworm poo and sticks and stones and all sorts of things, and they use these to clog up the mouth of their burrow. It was Charles Darwin that did a lot of the early studies on these, and you can see them in the pictures. There's one there, and we've got two in this picture here. And I'd hazard a guess that they're about the perfect distance apart for two earthworms to mate and still keep their tail anchored in their burrow in case they need to quickly retreat because a predator comes along. So Lumbricus terrestris will do that. Other anisic species, you'll see these big casts on the surface. They're an indication that you might have, for example, the black-headed earthworm, which is Aparectidae longa, or its closely related cousin, Aparectidae nocturna. So earthworm casts are just poop that they'll excrete from their anus. Earthworms can turn around in their burrows, and they can point their anus out to excrete at the top of there as well. So yeah, so just to recap, anisic earthworms are big, they're deep red in colour, they feed on soil and leaves, and yeah, come out at night. So the next type of earthworm we've got are the endogeics, and these are the shallow burrowing earthworms. These will rarely come to the surface, although you do sometimes see them out after it's been raining. They live in horizontal burrows in the upper surfaces, upper soil layers. They feed on soil, so they're not eating leaves, things like that. They're usually pale in colour. The colour can be pink, it can be grey, it can be green, it can be yellow, it can be blue. The colour's not based on pigmentation like the anisic earthworms, so sometimes you can see their guts through them and things like that, but yeah, a lot of variation in the colours with these, and they're usually a medium to large size, so but that is variable. Some species are 2 centimetres, some are 18 centimetres, so there is a lot of variation there. When we look at their burrowing depths, so where do you find these in the soil? Again, it varies a lot, and they'll go deeper when they want to get away from unfavourable conditions, but in general, they tend to be found within the top 8 centimetres of the soil, which you can see quite clearly here. They're heavily, predominantly in the top 8 centimetres. But our largest species, which is Octalasian cyanium, can commonly be found as deep as 15 centimetres. I mentioned earlier about some species being associated with wet conditions. So there are some endogeic earthworms that are particularly associated with wet soils. Some of them are specifically wet soil specialists, so you'll only get them in habitats where there's really, really wet soils. So Icinella tetraedra, sorry for the scientific names, these species don't have common names, is a very common earthworm that is found wherever there are wet soils. So I guarantee if you've got wet soils, you found this little brown red earthworm called the Icinella tetraedra in those soils. 2 of our rarest earthworms are wet soil specialists. So their names are Sparganophilus temesis and Helodrillus oculatus. They're very rare, or are they? Or are they just really understudied because there hasn't been a lot of research on earthworms in wetland habitats. Right. Okay, moving on to the third ecological category, we've got the epigeic earthworms. These are the surface-dwelling earthworms. Now we say surface-dwelling, but you will quite often get them in the very top layer of the soil as well, particularly if they're trying to get away from unfavourable conditions. But you'll usually get them living in the substrate that they eat, which is leaf litter, dung, deadwood, decaying plant or animal waste material. They're usually found in the surface, rarely in the soil. We'll come back to that later. And they tend to be smaller in size, so between 1.5 and 4.5 centimetres. but size does vary by species and even individually as well. So going back to the suntan analogy, the endogeics were pale and looked quite sickly. They were never out in the open. The epigeics live on the surface, so they're quite often a very deep red, dark in colour, and they tend to be darker along the whole length of the body as well. They may get a bit paler towards the tail, but they don't get as pale as the anesic earthworms. So here's an example of one living within the deadwood substrate that it feeds on. You do also, there are some specialists that you get in trees as well. So you do find earthworms living up trees. You get this in bromeliads in the tropics, for example. In the UK, we do have one species that wherever you find them in rottles or in the forks of trees where there's decaying plant material, you'll get one species, but you will still get that on the ground as well in the same kind of habitats that you'll find other epigeics, so under logs and things like that. Within the epigeic earthworms as well, you've got the compost earthworms, which they're really a subset of the epigeics, and we'll cover them now. So compost earthworms are high organic matter feeding earthworms. We call them compost earthworms because you generally find them in compost bins, but in nature you'd find them in dung, deadwood, and any other environment where there's a really high organic matter content to be found. They're usually found above ground, rarely in the soil. Like I said, they feed on those decaying plant and animal waste materials. Like the epigeic group that they're really a subset of, they're dark red in colour, but they're quite often stripy in appearance as well. Not always, but they have this stripy appearance with these almost red and yellow stripes, which is given one of the species its nickname, the tiger worm. They tend to be medium to large in size. So as with other earthworms, the size is variable, but they're often longer than the other epigeic earthworms. Little interesting thing here that you can take part in as well. On the Earthworm Society of Britain, under our projects menu, we've got a earthworm compost survey that you can take part in. And these are the results from the first part of that survey, but it's open again now. Out of 563 people that responded, one of the questions that we asked was, how did the worms colonize your compost bin? So 2% said they were already there, 7% said they were added, 2% said they weren't sure, but 89% of people said that these compost earthworms turned up by themselves. Now, these are specialist earthworms that only colonize these microhabitats that are really rich in high organic content. So I find it really fascinating and baffling how they find and colonize these habitats. How do they sense them? Where were they to get there? And dispersal of earthworms and understanding how they colonize these habitats is something that we still really know very little about. You can help us gather evidence that we need somebody to do a PhD on this by filling in that survey for us. If you've got more than one composting system, you can fill it in one time for each one. It'll only take you 5 minutes and the data is really useful. So yes, so compost earthworms include the tiger, or sometimes known as the brandling worm. Its scientific name is Icenia fetida. They also include, though, that's not the only stripy earthworm, and a common mistake that people make is if they've got stripy earthworms in their compost bin, they think it's the tiger or brandling worm. There's actually a species called Icenia andreae, which is very closely related to that. There is an argument that may not be stripy, so if you've got one that, but it's very difficult to tell them apart, and there's a bit of dispute about that. There's also Dendrobina veneta, which is known in the USA as a European nightcrawler, and that almost looks identical to the compost earthworm. They really need to be separated using a microscope. Right, okay. I don't know, Sophie, how we're doing for time. Have I gone over quite a bit?
No, you're good. You're good. Wonderful.
Okay, right. I've got a little bit more. Do you want me to carry on, or do we need to go to questions?
No, happy for you to carry on. We've got lots of time. Thank you so much, Keiron. It's absolutely amazing.
Okay, so I've got a quiz for you now. Now I'm going to test your knowledge / my teaching. And I'm going to launch a poll here, which asks you, in this picture, what ecological category is this earthworm? So we've got anesic, which is the deep burrowing earthworms. We've got endogeic, which is the shallow burrowing earthworms. We've got epigeic, which is the surface dwelling earthworms. And we've got compost, which is the high organic matter feeding earthworms. So I'm going to give you another 10, 15 seconds to have a guess. If you don't know, have a guess. Don't worry, I run an earthworm course where I teach this in a lot more detail and people still get it wrong. So people are inevitably going to get it wrong. It's not that easy. To give you a sense of scale, let's say this earthworm's about 7 centimeters long. Right, okay, right, share the results. So bit of variation in what people think, but 72% have gone for endogeic. Yeah, it's really pale in colour. I can actually, as well, I can quite clearly see the gut through the top of the earthworm there, and all the way along. You can see this dark line running along it, which tells me there's not really much pigmentation or any pigmentation in this earthworm. So yeah, for those that guessed endogeic, brilliant. It's really pale. It doesn't look like it's got a tan. Right, what about this one? This is a tricky one, this one. So let's launch that poll again. So is this earthworm the anesic earthworm? It's about 4 centimeters long. So is it an anesic earthworm, which is one of those deep burrowing earthworms? Is it is it pale? Is it epigeic? Is it one of those surface dwelling earthworms? Or is it a compost earthworm? Is it one of those high organic matter feeding earthworms? Right, I'm going to give you a 5-second warning. I'm going to go faster to make sure I get through everything. So if you haven't had a guess, stick a quick guess in. Right, okay, we'll share those results. So 65% of you have went with epigeic. I'd agree with you. It's got quite a deep red colour. It does get paler towards the tail, but the giveaway was that size, that 4 centimeters. An anesic earthworm, even a juvenile, would probably be longer than that. So yeah, it is a epigeic earthworm, but it shows you that it's not quite as easy as I make out when I'm going through them. Right, we've got one here. This is 18 centimeters long, for reference. Wow. And it's found in the soil in a river when it's retreated a bit, when the tide's gone in. So is this an anesic earthworm? Is it a deep burrowing earthworm? Is it an endogeic earthworm that's shallow burrowing, epigeic on the surface? Or is it a composting earthworm that specializes in high organic matter content microhabitats? I'm going to give you another 5 seconds. So if you haven't got your answer in, get it in quick. There's a few last minute coming in there. All right, okay. So we're much more confident with this one. We're thinking 88% anesic. I'd agree. In fact, I know what this is because you'll see that's got my name on it. So I identify this earthworm, and it was a Lumbricus terrestris. So it's one of that big lobworm in the anesic species. Now, a real giveaway for this one as well is the flattened tail. Anesic earthworms are able to flatten their tail in a paddle shape to anchor themselves in their burrows when they're out feeding. So when they're moving about, and particularly if you touch them and stress them, they tend to do that flattening behavior as well. All right, okay, let's stop sharing that and let's go on to the next one. So our last one. What ecological category is this one? Is it anesic? Is it a deep burrowing earthworm? I'll tell you, it's about 14 centimeters long. Is it endogeic? Is it epigeic? Is it compost? So endogeic is shallow burrowing in the horizontal burrows, eating soil. Epigeic is living on the surface, eating leaf litter, things like that. Composting is the high organic content specialist. Right, I'll just give you 5 more seconds if you haven't got your vote in. Oh, they're flying up now. People panicking. 3, 2, 1. All right, let's see what people said. 74% have went with endogeic. Now, this is quite long for an endogeic earthworm, but some of the endogeics do give some of the anesics a run for their money. So it is quite big. It looks like it might even be flattening itself a bit on part of that as well, which is quite anesic sounding. But the giveaway is the colour. It's really pale. There's no pigmentation. There's no deep red colour there. So yeah, that is an endogeic earthworm. So stop sharing. Oh no, I've got one more. Not that one. We've had that one. Right, last one. Is this an anesic deep burrowing? Is it endogeic? I'm only going to give you a very short time to vote on this. Endogeic, is it a shallow burrowing, soil-eating earthworm? Is it an epigeic, a surface-dwelling earthworm? I'm not going to tell you the size either. Or is it a compost earthworm? Is it a specialist in high organic content? Right, I'm going to close the poll now. And 96%, so this is the most confidence we've had so far, are saying it is a composting earthworm. I can tell you that this earthworm was taken from a compost bin. It is stripy in appearance. It's from a compost bin in Devon, actually. So yeah, it is a compost earthworm. It was identified species afterwards and confirmed as well. So yeah, right. Okay, so that's it for our test. Couple of last things I wanted to talk to you about. So now we've been through the different ecological categories. You're all earthworm experts. You've done a little test and you've done really well. I want to let you know that actually it's a little bit more complicated than that in life. So that's what we use when we're describing earthworm ecology, to simplify it for people. And the scientist that came up with these categories was a French scientist called Bush, and he categorized these 3 types of ecological category, but he kind of did it on a scale. And what he did was he used a number of what they call morpho-anatomical traits to categorize these earthworms. So things like length, weight, pigmentation, skin coloration, etc. But really, earthworms are on a scale with all of these different things. So if we look at just the simple epigeic, endogeic, and anesic categories, we can see that when they're looking at length, the average length for an epigeic is 62 millimeters versus 34.9 centimeters for an anesic. Now, I should point out this is being done based on French earthworms. The French have pretty much everything that we have in the British Isles, bar one, I think, bar one species potentially, but they also have a lot more. They have over 100, I think, versus our 31. So yeah, so if we look at length, we can see there is a clear difference between anesic, endogeic, and epigeic. Same with diameter and weight. If we look at pigmentation, we can see that epigeics and anesics have 100% of them have pigmentation, whereas endogeics, 0% of them have pigmentation. This other thing that I'd like to point out as well is we've got this thing, colour. Now, colour and pigmentation are different. Pigmentation is when the earthworm has pigment that causes the colour, but colour can be caused by many different things, including pigmentation. And the general colour for these groups are red, pink, and grey. Although I disagree with that with the British species. Another thing I want to point out is this flattening index. So how much can they flatten? You can see here that the anesics, half of them are able to flatten their body from the clitellum down and the tail. So it's a bit more complicated than that. We can see here as well, we've got this other category, epianesics, so somewhere between that and that. And actually, if we map them out on a triangle where you've got epigeic at the top here, endogeic here, and anesic here, earthworms actually fall somewhere on a scale between the 3. So it is a bit more complicated, and only of the ones that the French have done here, they reviewed this last year, only a few of them have come out as pure anesic earthworms, pure endogeic or pure epigeic. So earthworms do display features from multiple, and we can see that we've got an epiendogeic, epianesic, and an endoanesic category. We've even got a category in the middle here where earthworms will fall into all three categories, and 2 of those species we have in the UK. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to get the Earthworm Society to pay these French scientists to do this specifically for the British ones, so we've got a better categories. So if you're struggling to categorize them, don't beat yourself up about it. It's because it's a lot more complicated in reality than I've made out. So the citizen science surveys that are out there that ask people to categorize them by ecological category don't take into consideration these difficulties as well. So I was just mentioning there how there's still lots of things that we need to find out. And I just want to point out that earthworms are a relatively understudied group of organisms. And if we look at a map of the world and how their earthworm species checklists, we can see that not all of the world has been checklisted for earthworms. And this is taken from a study in 2009 from an earthworm scientist called Robert Blakemore. And we can see from this that there are still massively uncharted territories. As far as I'm aware, there's been no species recorded in Antarctica, but it hasn't been checklisted. Vast parts of Africa still need a lot of work, as does the Middle East. And some of these countries that have been checklisted, like Brazil, there are parts of Brazil, like the Amazon, has not been properly surveyed. There are still species in the Amazon that we do not know about because there are giant earthworm casts where we've never found the species that makes them. So there's still a lot of work to do. And even in the UK, which is one of the most well-studied territories for earthworms around the world, back in 2009, a study to collate earthworm records from researchers from research institutions and local environmental record centres found that we had just 3,941 earthworm species records. So they collated them, and this is a map of all species of earthworm in the UK in 2009. Now, vast parts of Northern Ireland and Wales have no earthworms at all recorded there. I doubt that Wales would be as good for farming as it is if it had no earthworms. So the Earthworm Society of Britain was basically set up off the back of this in 2009. In 2014, we launched our earthworm recording scheme. And I've been working on that since with a range of volunteers from around the country. And I'm pleased to say that we've now got over 18,000 records. So we went from just shy of 14,000 to around 18,000 earthworm species record for the UK, Channel Islands and Ireland. So yeah, we've got some extra dots down here that we never had. So you can see we've started filling in some of these gaps. So again, this is for all species. We've still got no records for the Isle of Man. That's something that I still need to get on top of. We were hoping to go there last year, but obviously COVID got in the way. But what about down here in Surrey? So in Surrey, the Vice County of Surrey, we've got 389 verified accepted earthworm species records. So that's across all species. So there's still a lot of work to do in Surrey as well. So what's coming out of what's the point in recording our earthworms? Well, this graph here is from a Natural England report in 2014, where they commissioned some work. So they had that data from the 2009 report plus some extra data, and they looked at the percentage of Great Britain earthworms by species. So we can see here that Allolobophora chlorotica, according to this report, made up 34% of all earthworms found in sampling and studies. I took that data and I added the Earthworm Society of data up until the end of 2017, and I replicated that graph, and I got a very different result. So even with just a little bit of recording and getting those records up to 18,000, what I found is that actually this species here has gone down a lot from being 34% to 11.9%. So it's still one of the most common earthworms, or the most abundant earthworms, but it's been overtaken by Lumbricus rubellus, which was down here. And the reason for that is back in 2009, all of our data was, or almost all of our data was from agricultural research and woodland research. So we had really biased data. We're starting to even that out. We've got more wetland data. We've got loads more data from gardens and parks. So it's starting to be a bit more even. But what this tells us is what we were saying about earthworms in 2009, based on very limited knowledge, is changing a lot. And that's purely through gathering more information from research records and volunteer recorders going out, identifying earthworms and submitting their records. So yeah, the percentage of the most common species, Allelobifora chlorotica, is 3 times less when you take into account our data. And our data there still has these biases there because it still includes that data. The diversity is less polar, so we can see this graph is less steep, so it's not a steeper curve here. And many species that were classified as rare in 2014 are turning up more commonly here. So we can see we've got quite a few zeros here. We've got a few less zeros here, and some of the rare species are turning up a bit more. Natural England were going to declare this species here, Dendrobina pygmaea, which is 0 here, as extinct. And they actually they checked their report with me before they published it. And I told them that we'd found it 3 or 4 times that year. We found it more times since. So it's just because of knowing where to look for it and getting more people looking. So I thought I'd end with what you can do for earthworms. So this is just my top 10 tips for gardening for earthworms, because I'm guessing that Wildlife Trust members want to know how they can do their bit for earthworms. And all of this centers around what I've taught you earlier today about the different ecological groups of earthworms. So if we want to help earthworms, we need to think about those different ecological categories and the different microhabitats and how we can do more to get bigger diversity of earthworms that are all doing slightly different jobs in our garden. So the number one tip that everybody can do, regardless of the size of the outdoor space that you have, or even if you don't have any, is compost. So composting, even if you introduce the earthworms into the system, will give you at least one species of earthworm that you might not otherwise have. It also means that we can reduce our carbon footprint by dealing with our food waste and garden waste on site. And I don't really understand why garden waste is a thing. Why would we take nutrients out of our garden and put them somewhere else? We want to keep those nutrients within the gardening space, and it gives us a great product, a homemade fertilizer to put on our gardens. Leaf litter. If you don't have leaf litter, if you clear up your leaves, there's no food for the anisic earthworms, and there's no substrate or food for the epigeic earthworms. So leave your leaf litter in your garden, or at least mulch your borders and have that habitat somewhere. Deadwood is fantastic for earthworms, so it's great for the epigeic earthworms. You will find I'm forgetting the names, the composting earthworms in really rotten deadwood. If you lift up a log, you'll quite often find all 3, if not all 4, different ecological categories of earthworm under there. So they're fantastic. And you get them living under the bark, under the logs, and maybe even within the logs. Now, not everybody has soil. I rent a property and I've got stone patio and, heaven forbid, a plastic lawn. I have no control over it. That's what my landlord's installed. So what can I do with no grass lawn to encourage earthworms? Well, even if you've got a patio, you can have plant pots, and you'll get earthworms living within the plant pots. When it's damp, you'll find them underneath it. So creating these extra microhabitats is great for earthworms. So plant pots, even under bags of leaf litter and things like that, you'll find earthworms. A tree, we talked about an arboreal earthworm. You're not going to have an arboreal earthworm if you don't have a tree. Trees will also provide leaf litter. They'll also provide shelter for the earthworms in the root systems, and they'll shade part of the garden, so they provide variation in soil conditions. So if it's too dry in one part of your garden, underneath the tree where it's a bit more shaded, it might be slightly less dry. Structure, adding lots of different layers of vegetation to to your garden increases the variability of the microhabitats and is great for earthworms. You might try a no-dig system in your garden. I had a brilliant photo from somebody who has employed that system in part of her garden, and it was just rich with earthworm casts. I've never seen so many. No chemicals. This should go without saying, and I'm probably preaching to the converted here. I won't go into too much detail, but chemicals can harm earthworms. Earthworms can also act as a reservoir of toxic chemicals, and when birds and other predators are eating them, it can kill their predators. Water, we talked about wet soil specialists. You could have a bog garden. That's fantastic for earthworms. And finally, grass clippings. Grass is full of nitrogen, which earthworms need and eat. So yeah, they will eat the grass clippings. So maybe there's a part of the garden that you'll leave the grass clippings there for the earthworms to feed on. And I'm just going to end the talk with saying that this was a very brief and quick whistle-stop tour of earthworms, but the Earthworm Society of Britain does have a range of earthworm courses and events. At the moment, most of those are on hold, but we do have our Discovering Earthworms course that we're running with the Field Studies Council online. That is heavily subsidised by the National Lottery as well, so it's available for just £20 from the Field Studies Council website, and that's starting, I think, on the 13th or 14th of July, and that'll be taught by me and a Earthworm Society of Britain tutor, Kerry Calloway, that has taught for Surrey Wildlife Trust before. So yeah, that's available if people are interested. And that, I believe, is it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Keiron. That was absolutely amazing, fascinating. And well done, everyone, for taking part in those polls. Brilliant. Right, well, let's move on to some questions. We have quite a few questions coming in, some from earlier on in your presentation. Pip asks, a lemon-shaped cocoon may only hatch one worm, so how often are cocoons dropped? Will one mating make several cocoons? That's a brilliant question. I'd love to know the answer to that.
Yeah, so the way it works is when they've mated, if we talk about one worm, so they've mated, and when they've mated, they've shared their sperm. So they don't fertilize the egg during the actual mating. They just give sperm to the other earthworm that stores it in the spermathecal pods. Once they've separated, when the earthworm is ready to, I suppose if we use the term lay, I've never heard that before, but lay a cocoon, what will happen is around the clitellum, it will form this mucus sheath. That mucus sheath will move along the earthworm. It will pick up an egg or multiple eggs, but usually in the UK, it's just one egg for British species. That will then travel down and pick up the sperm, and then it will come off the end of the earthworm, form a lemon shape, and the egg will be fertilized inside that cocoon. So that means that it's just a single cocoon per mating. So, but how many will they lay varies. So it tends to be that the surface dwelling earthworms, the compost earthworms and the epigeic earthworms, are quite fast living. They live fast, die young, and they will produce many cocoons very, very quickly. Whereas the bigger animals, the anisic earthworms, will be much more seasonal in their lifestyle. They might live over a year, for example, and they'll put a lot more energy into one cocoon. It'll also be protected because it's deep down, so they don't have to live as fast. Hopefully that answers the question.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking that. Right, Chris wanted to ask, are there any invasive species to be wary of? Great question again.
Yes, there are, and they're all British species, or they're all cosmopolitan species that we have that have colonized Britain naturally. So we've got two species that are possibly non-native, but they're not particularly well established. I've never seen either of them, and I went looking specifically for one. So we don't tend to need to worry about earthworm species being invasive in the UK. Something we never hear about in the UK is what our wildlife does to the rest of the world. So the maple forests of the Great Lakes area in the United States are actually slowly being destroyed by earthworms from Europe and Asia. So these cosmopolitan species you get all around the world, they're quite often being introduced, sometimes on purpose, to help with agricultural systems, etc. But they've come across in potted plants. They're still sold as fishing bait and as compost earthworms. So all the species I've been talking about today, you'll find in the States, in an area, the Great Lakes area, where there is no native earthworms, because no earthworms have colonized there since the last ice age. Now, if you imagine a system that is not used to having earthworms, the leaf litter breaks down much, much slower. So you get this layer called the duff layer that can be up to 8 centimeters high. Now, as plants, animal, fungi are used to, that's the system they've evolved alongside, they're used to not being exposed to herbivores and predators, etc. Earthworms come along, they break down that leaf litter in no time at all. So those plants, those animals lose that protection. So our earthworms can be very, very destructive elsewhere. Saying that, it's still legal to sell these species for fishing bait in the USA, which bewilders me, if I'm honest, because they are damaging to parts of the USA. The only invasive species that we really need to worry about in the UK are actually flatworms, which are not related to earthworms at all. They're not segmented. And we've got a number of species of flatworm that feed on earthworms. We've got the New Zealand flatworm, which people may have heard of, which is a really dangerous predator for the anisic earthworms in particular, because it's the only predator that can go down an earthworm's burrow and eat the earthworm in its burrow. So there have been studies to see the impact in the UK. They found, from what I've read, that it's not something to be worried about, but anecdotally I've been told by by a few recorders up in Scotland that they have lots of the New Zealand flatworms and they never find the anisic ones, or they find them really difficult. In the southwest, we've got a problem with the Australian flatworm, which is actually, it's quite different from the New Zealand flatworm. You tend to get it in large numbers when you do get it, and it will also feed on earthworms, but I believe it feeds on, the main impact it has is on other types of earthworm, not necessarily the anisic ones, and it will upset the balance. A third species is the Obama flatworm, which we still don't know a lot about. It's a new introduction. But yeah, so the threats that I've heard about for our earthworms are non-native invasive flatworms. There's a lot more, there's a bit more information on the Earthworm Society of Britain website. There's also, you can report your flatworms to Bug Life through their website as well.
Brilliant. That's fascinating to hear, because we often sort of hear about what the invasive species to our country, and then our little home creatures get out of control and cause havoc elsewhere. Really fascinating.
We are the grey squirrel when it comes to earthworms.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that. Right, I can just a little reminder here. Sorry, I can see a couple of questions coming in through the chat, which I have noticed, and I will get to them. If you have any more questions, if you could put them in the question and answer, because I can multitask, but keeping an eye on 3 or 4 screens at the same time is a little bit challenging for me. So it'll make my life easier, but I will get round to the questions already posted in the chat. So I will go now to Dorothy. Asked, how big are the cocoons? Can you see them in the soil easily? That's a great question.
And it's got 2 answers, yes and no. So if we
Clear as mud.
If we think about it, the anisic earthworms, the biggest one, Lumbricus terrestris, it can grow up to 35 centimeters. It can be over 10 centimeters and still not be an adult. I think I've seen quite big ones before that still don't have a saddle. So it's a big animal for an invertebrate, for something living in the soil. It's a fair size. Naturally, its cocoons are a fair size as well. So that big endogeic one that I mentioned, Uptilasian cyaneum, it can grow up to 15 or 18 centimeters, I think it was. Again, that's got quite big cocoons, as do all of the anisic ones, and you can see them quite easy with the naked eye. They're quite often a yellowy color, but they can be a bit more brown, so the color's very variable. And they almost look like little seeds, but they've got a bit of give in them that you can tell they've got a liquid inside. If you find them, don't press them too hard, because obviously you don't want to squash the baby inside. So yes, you can see them with the naked eye. Our smaller species of earthworm, Dendrobina pygmea, that one that was nearly classed as extinct, grows up to, is 1.5 centimeters as an adult. Are you going to be able to see the cocoon for that species with the naked eye? Probably not. So if you look closely in your compost, you'll see smaller cocoons that belong to the composting earthworms. If you're digging in your garden and you find those bigger cocoons, they're probably from an anisic species. So yeah, yes, you can see some. You definitely can't see all. You can actually tell the species of earthworm as well by the shape of the cocoon. It's not something that I can do, and it's not something that our UK expert on earthworms can do. But apparently the cocoons can be quite distinctive to the species based on size and shape as well.
Wow, I have visions of everyone attending tonight going out with a microscope and macro lenses tomorrow and examining their compost heaps. Brilliant.
Yeah, but
Let us know what you find.
if they send in their pictures of the cocoons, I cannot identify them. So I'll happily take pictures of cocoons to use on the website, but I can't give you a species.
I fear that's a bit of a challenge. Right, who's up for that challenge? Right, moving swiftly on. A question for Dorothy again. If earthworms don't drown in waterlogged soils, why do you find so many dead ones in puddles or my pond after the rain?
Well, a puddle, that might get deoxygenated quite quickly. So, but what tends to happen a lot with earthworms when they come out after the rain is they come out because it's raining, it's been raining, it's wet, and they can move actually very easily and safely in the water on the surface compared to if they were doing that, if it was sunny, they would, yeah. So what happens is the sun comes out and they get trapped, they get stuck. So that's why when you find them, they'll be quite dry and limp afterwards. But yeah, they might deoxygenate a small puddle, and in a pond, if it's a pond with a liner, I don't know, they should be okay in that. It might be that they're being dropped in by things, and it's not their ideal environment. It's not where they're supposed to live. They're designed to live in the earth, but they can breathe in water. So when we're talking about their biology, they can breathe in water. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, this is something you covered at the end, but I feel it's important to sort of ask again, actually. Chris asks, apart from avoiding chemicals, what can we do in our gardens to help earthworms thrive? I tend to leave grass cuttings in situ on the lawn and presume the worms take them quite readily. ... question mark.
Yeah, I mean, it is really just about, so those are my tips, but none of them are necessarily proven. They're all about thinking about the ecology and the behaviors of earthworms and how can we help them. So yeah, just like if you were planting for pollinators, you would be planting a mix of things to cater for different pollinators. You'd be planting some things evening flower because you'd want to get pollinators that come out at night. You'd be thinking of things throughout the year to give for pollinators that are active at different times of year. So it's the same with earthworms. If you want earthworms to thrive, I think in terms of population, you want to make sure that you're not taking nutrients out of the garden. You're allowing the earthworms to do that job naturally for you and recycle them. And you're not using chemicals. You're maybe reducing the amount of digging that you do. It's a bit rich me saying that since I go digging for them. But so that's what can help with abundance. with diversity, it's about microhabitats. It's about as much variation as possible. And that's one of the real strengths of gardens, not just for earthworms, but for lots of species, that gardens are offering this wealth of many different microhabitats. But I mean, I find them in all sorts of places. You find them in wood chip, you find them under paving slabs. Don't tell my landlord, but you find them under plastic lawns when you rip them up as well.
Brilliant. They'll find a way.
In fact, I found one. I found an anetic earthworm that was completely pale, and that Lumbricus tressus, which has never been seen before. It's went off to the Natural History Museum it's been sequenced by Oxford University to have a look at it because it's so weird. So yeah, so just variation, and again, a bit rich, but avoid plastic lawns, avoid paving, avoid decking. But these things that I'm saying to a Wildlife Trust members audience, I probably don't need to. You've probably all got great gardens for earthworms, and if you're already composting and leaving your grass clippings, and you've got tree and structure to your garden, then it's already great.
No, it's all good information, just reinforcing the message, and it's a different way of sort of telling people new stuff, and it's very important. So yeah, no, tell us, absolutely. Right, I'm going to combine two questions. One that's come in from Harriet and one that's come in from Pip on the chat. Pip asked, is ploughing harmful to earthworms? And then Harriet has asked, are there any species of earthworm under threat of extinction due to intensive farming methods and or loss of habitat? I felt those questions went sort of quite well together.
Okay, so ironically, all the data we have is on things that you find in agricultural soils. So the things that we know the most about are the things that you do find in those systems. So the only species that we've got that we would maybe need to look more at their conservation status are pretty much the wet soil specialists, which we have so few data and so little data on that we can't make an assessment because enough wetlands haven't been sampled for them, etc. So we really don't have enough information to apply conservation status in the UK. There is one species I know of that has a conservation status applied